So this is a literature review that David Atkin and I, as the senior editors, pulled together a fantastic group of editors to help write particular subsections of this review that we're going to outline. Laura Boudreau, who's at Columbia, Rafael Dix-Conero at Duke, Isabella Manalici at LSE, Pamela Medina at Toronto, Brian McKegg at Wilfrid Laurier, Amit Majari at Northwestern, Luigi Pasquelli at UPF, Bob Reichers at the World Bank, and Meredith Starts. And the way that we design this literature review, as you'll see, is that there's different sections, and each of these editors are specialists in these subsections. And so let me just give an overview of what this review is about. So if you think about the international trade literature and what are the big questions for anyone interested in international trade policy, we think there's kind of three very large questions out there. So what are the aggregate gains from trade or potential losses from trade? Who are the winners and losers when trade policy changes? And how are trade costs, tariffs being one of them, but other forms of trade costs determined? So these are kind of the big three questions where if you look at papers being written on international trade, by and large, papers try to speak to one of these three types of questions. And our sense is that trade policy is of particular interest to policymakers in developing countries. And this, I think, remains true even despite the large set of trade reforms that we've seen in countries, developing countries over the past 30 years. Trade barriers remain high in developing countries. You can see this in different ways. So one is just to look at average tariff rates. And so this picture just shows average tariff rates as they've evolved between high-income countries and lower and middle-income countries. And you can see that since the 90s, there has been a very large liberalization. But even today, tariff rates are higher in developing countries, and tariffs are only one form of trade costs. That there are, of course, many others. Another way to see that there's interest amongst policymakers is to turn to two kind of interesting sets of documents. One set of documents that are released every year are the Article 4 consultation documents that the IMF releases. So these are kind of annual surveillance that the IMF releases on all member nations of the IMF. And if you look into those documents, trade policy is sometimes written about with respect to each country. And this just shows a frequency of how important or how frequent particular trade-related words, the word trade, imports, exports, tariff, and duties are in the relative in the documents across countries. And you can see kind of in lower income countries, trade tends to be mentioned more often relative to developed countries in these Article 4 documents. Another place to look at this or to try to infer the potential interest amongst policymakers is to look at the WTO trade policy reports. And again, this is an interesting source of data in some sense, because these are standardized across countries in the template and how it's reported by the WTO. And here what we're doing is we're looking at the frequency in the most recent one set of reports that we accessed were back in 2017. The incidence of kind of traditional trade policy, which we can think of as tariff rates or the mention of the word duties, relative to other forms of trade policies that are actively discussed more so in the developed world, things like intellectual property, copyrights, and trademarks. And here you see that there's relatively more interest in kind of the non-traditional forms of trade policy, like intellectual property in the developed world, where the developing world is still interested in, or still has some emphasis on, more emphasis on tariffs and duties. And so these three kinds of pieces of evidence kind of suggest that trade is important and particularly important and on the minds of policymakers in the developing world. Okay, so now if you go back to the trade literature, which is interested in these three types of questions. Again, if you look at the introductions of these papers, they will often speak in some way or kind of utilize in some fashion what we might consider as workhorse models. So if you're interested in the aggregate gains and losses from trade, you're going to think about the Ricardian framework, or in its modern conception of this, the Eaton and Cordham framework, which tells you kind of very, very nicely how to think about aggregate losses and gains from trade. if you're interested in the winners and losers, the distributional consequences of trade, our workers framework is the Heckscher-Lin framework, or the modern version of this on the firm side is the Melitz framework, in which firms may differ in productivity and trade may benefit disproportionately some sets of firms as opposed to others. And if you're interested in how trade costs are determined, particularly in the political economy of trade barriers, then Grossman and Hauptmann's frameworks and its subsequent versions of that have built up that framework are useful tools. Now, if you think about these frameworks, standard models are, they typically abstract from the economic environments that we think characterize developing countries, such as high degrees of different types of distortions or frictions. And as a result, the impacts of changing trade barriers or other forms of complementary policies in a developing country may be quite different from the predictions from what we would get from standard workhorse models. Moreover, developing countries may actually think about trade reforms as a way to improve resource allocation or raise productivity through learning by exporting, channels that are typically absent from standard models. And so if you want to think about how trade interacts with features of developing countries, these kind of classic frameworks are helpful guides, but we think might miss some important features and important outcomes when thinking about how existing distortions within developing countries interact with changes in trade policy or trade reforms. So when thinking about how to organize this literature, this was kind of the starting point, and what we kind of coalesced around were three very broad frictions that the development literature has argued is pervasive in developing countries, but are typically absent from trade models. And these are weak institutions, different forms of market level distortions, and different forms of firm level distortions. And it turns out that over the past 10 years or so, there's been kind of a wave of work straddling trade and development that are actually speaking to how these different distortions interact with trade. And so what this survey is trying to do is to think about how do different types of more specific distortions within these three may or may not interact with trade. And by and large, we're going to emphasize in this literature review empirical papers using microdata. And we think that this is a really promising area for a couple of reasons. So first is our sense, and you can just actually look at the set of editors that we drew upon, is that this is a kind of a big tent literature in the sense in terms of methods. So the sets of papers we're going to review range from kind of descriptive data to randomized controlled trials to calibrated models. So it's kind of the full spectrum of kind of tools that are used across different fields and are kind of being brought into this literature. And they're often being applied on tailored surveys, customs level data that are now being increasingly accessed from least developed countries, firm to firm transactions data, which allows you to track flows within a value chain, and often sector specific, which allows you to get into the institutional details of particular sectors. And so the combination of a diverse range of methods plus new sets of data, we think is a really exciting place to be working in this. And so what you'll see from this literature review is that it's still a little bit unclear how different distortions interact with trade, generalize across different settings, either across different sectors or across different countries or different time periods. One exception is that we do think we have a better understanding of now the implications of trade and labor markets and material market distortions. But there is kind of a lot of open areas of research, we think, in this area. Okay, so how is this literature organized? How does this survey organized? So we're going to think about the impacts of trade with three broad distortions: weak institutions, market failures, and firm distortions. And within each of these three pillars, there's going to be these kind of sub distortions that we'll think about. So with weak institutions, we're going to think about tariff evasion, contract enforceability, regulatory enforceability, and institutions themselves, and what is the implications of trade interacting with these three forms of specific types of weak institutions. In terms of market failures, we're going to think about the first four being labor, capital, material, land, or energy, kind of factors of production, and the fact that in developing countries, those there may be failures in those markets for various reasons, and what happens when trade comes, and how does it intersect, and how do those distortions affect what we might consider, and where there may be deviations from standard models. But there may be other additional market level forces, failures, such as imperfect competition, high internal trade costs, and then just failures in what we might think of as knowledge markets, or in information or knowledge frictions. And then finally, turning from market levels to firm distortions, we know that developing countries are typically characterized by a large number of small and informal firms. They have often a powerful network of connected firms that may be business groups or family-run firms, or connected in other ways. And these may interact with trade in ways that standard models just don't think carefully about, and there may be additional externalities associated with it. And so the idea in the survey is to take the set of papers largely written over the past 10-15 years or so, and try to group them into these distortions that they're speaking to when thinking about the impacts of trade. Okay, so let's turn to weak institutions. So weak institutions is, of course, a defining features of least developed countries, with the weak rule of law being the most glaring manifestation of weak institutions. We think that institutions affect every step of a transaction, from the initial idea that an entrepreneur has to the very final sale of that good. And of course, institutions are going to matter for any kind of transaction, either international or domestic. But one thing that is unique or different about international transactions is they typically involve larger monetary costs and certainly larger time costs. And so that means that the role of institutions may be more important or more salient when thinking about international transactions. So where we think that the literature has had actually quite a longer history of thinking about weak institutions and trade is in the form of tariff evasion. So I think there is now robust evidence of tariff evasion through different countries, typically coming through the under-invoicing of imports. And this can potentially matter because it means that there may be revenue that's altering the typical cost-benefit calculation that we think about when doing a trade policy exercise. Tariff evasion may be performed or done by certain kinds of firms with certain kinds of access, which is effectively introducing a size-dependent distortion, where some firms are paying tariffs and other firms are not within a country. We know that, particularly these days, industrial policy through trade is still actively used in developing countries. But if there is rampant tariff evasion, it means that tariffs as a form of industrial policy may be ineffective. And then it may be also enriching corrupt bureaucrats. And so we go through in the literature review different papers that have spoken to the issues of tariff evasion, how it's detected, and what the size of the magnitudes are. But where we think there's still some scope for open question is that what are the specific policies countries may have to reduce tariff evasion? For instance, electronic digitization, certain incentive changes within the customs bureaucracy. There are a couple of interesting studies that are speaking to this at the moment, but we think that this is kind of a ripe area for future work. Turning to contracting, I think one thing that the literature has sort of established is that the lack of contract enforceability or the weaker enforceability of contracts in developing countries is going to shape countries' comparative advantage. And some papers have argued that this can lead lower income countries to end up specializing in quote unquote low value sectors, where different papers have different meaning of the word low value sectors, and which this kind of paints kind of a pessimistic picture of what happens if a country changes its trade costs in the presence of weak contract enforcement. On the other hand, a recent set of interesting and exciting papers are kind of establishing that one way in which firms in developing countries mitigate these enforcement challenges is to rely on relational contracts. And it's been shown that these relational contracts are actually quite valuable. They may actually affect the organizational structure of firms themselves. For instance, it may incentivize firms to vertically integrate in order to get around standard contractual issues. But at the same time, it may mean that certain firms which already have the connections or already have the relationships are going to benefit more than others. And so I think one area of open work is sort of thinking about contract enforceability and how important contract enforceability is for trade within global value chains. And here, I think there is a lot of interesting progress being made in the literature, both through kind of tailored surveys that are sector or location specific to think about how important are different aspects of contracts or observability of things like quality in particular sectors, and then also combining that potentially with access to firm-to-firm administrative data, where you can actually see the linkages of transactions within a country across firms. Now, the third aspect of weak institutions that we think matter for international trade is the enforcement or lack thereof of regulation. So across the world, most countries on the books have reasonably high environmental standards, have standards on child labor, have standards on safety conditions, but where the degree of variation comes is in the enforcement of those standards across countries. One of the things that comes out in the literature that has studied this is that it does seem that exporting firms or export-oriented firms do have better working conditions, and the channel through which, that relative to domestic firms or firms that sell only domestically, and this we think is likely due to the fact that the final customers that the exporters are serving value enforcement in some way. And so this raises the question that if enforcement is valued and demanded by a group of customers from a particular location, how do you actually enforce that in a setting where the government may be unable to or unwilling to enforce it? And here there's I'll just highlight two interesting papers that are examining two specific policies to improve worker conditions from firms. And I highlight this both because they're recent, but also because they're very different methodologically. So the first is a randomized controlled trial that has looked at the establishment of worker safety committees in Bangladeshi apparel factories. And the interesting finding from that paper is that you can raise safety conditions for workers along a variety of dimensions without negatively impacting employment, which is kind of a very promising finding. And then if there's another kind of study at the moment, which is looking at responsible sourcing. So think of this as kind of fair trade type policies in Costa Rica. And they're using a more quantitative framework, thinking about the general equilibrium effects of fair trade. And there, what they find is that fair trade policies or responsible sourcing policies do seem to raise wages, but there is a cost to employment. And so I think these are two interesting studies that are looking at specific policies of the private sector to improve worker conditions. And of course, I think we need a lot more from these are of course Costa Rica versus Bangladesh, different sectors, different levels of economic development, and how that generalizes, I think, is a really important question. And then finally, thinking about weak institutions and international trade is the fact that trade may actually change institutions themselves. And I think that's quite exciting because the potential gains or losses, but gains from trade-induced institutional change may actually dwarf the static gains from trade from traditional frameworks, like static gains from trade frameworks that most of the trade literature is used to using when evaluating trade policy. And here, the literature, I think, has come around to kind of three mechanisms that emphasize how trade interacts with institutional trade. So the first is that trade seems to raise the demand for the rule of law. The second is that trade shifts the distribution of income across groups, where certain groups, such as merchants, may then capture local institutions and use those local institutions to change. To implement regulatory or policy or rule of law changes. And then finally, trade may actually change shared beliefs or the trust of in-group, relative trust of in-groups versus out-groups, that have some implications on state capacity. And so I think this literature is also very exciting just because the magnitudes could be quite big. And I think where we see potential for open areas of research is thinking about more recent past experience. So a lot of the institutional change in trade literature is looking at long historical episodes over the past 500 years, where we also know that there have been a handful of countries, particularly in East Asia, that have seen very fast increases in growth, commensurate with very fast integration into the global economy. And thinking about institutional change in those settings, I think remains an open question. Okay, David, I'll turn it to you.
Great, thanks so much, Amit, for that introduction and for talking us through the Weak Institutions section. Also, thank you once again to all of our co-authors on this. We wouldn't have been able to do this without you, and many of you are on the chat, are on the in the audience today, so welcome. So let me, I guess, pick up where Amit was. You know, we've divided this kind of our taxonomy. Already talked about weak institutions, and next we think about kind of market level distortions, by which we mean distortions which are, you know, common to all firms in a particular country. And here we have very much in mind, you know, highly regulated labor markets or imperfect credit markets that lead to, you know, credit restrictions that all firms in many developing countries face. And we'll turn to firm-specific distortions in the next section, although sometimes the distinction can be a bit murky. So as everyone here is probably aware, there's been a lot of evidence in the development literature for pervasive market level distortions in credit markets, in labor markets, in input markets, etc., in the developing world. You know, most directly, why does this matter for trade? Well, it can limit the ability of firms or workers to take advantage of the kind of many opportunities that trade provides. You know, for example, if you need kind of a bunch of capital to start exporting, you can only do that if possible to borrow often. And so that's going to kind of limit the gains from trade that a country can obtain. But the flip side is, you know, some of these distortions, such as labor regulations, may provide buffers which may be useful when there are kind of shocks coming about through trade liberalization or such like, or similarly, internal trade frictions may also potentially provide a buffer from the volatility of international markets if you do integrate more. And so those are kind of ways that directly these type of distortions are going to impact the gains from trade. You know, more generally, you know, one way to think about trade liberalization is a reduction in a distortion. In particular, you know, if you had a bunch of high tariffs, you know, those are distortionary, and by removing them, there should be allocative gains, which are kind of at the heart of the gains from trade. And, you know, we know from the theory of second best that in the presence of other distortions, such as in labor or capital markets or material markets, then you know, that removal of a single distortion, the trade barriers, may not necessarily improve the allocation of resources if, for example, it was kind of counterbalancing some other distortion. And so we kind of need to think carefully in this area about, you know, how these particular distortions interact with the gains trade generates. So we're going to do that by kind of thinking about a variety of different subtopics where we think market level distortions are important in developing countries. We'll think about labor, capital, materials, and other input markets, land, energy, etc. Then we'll think about imperfect competition. You know, markups are kind of a key distortion here. Of course, they may vary across firms, but we'll kind of discuss them here. And then also these internal trade frictions, poor infrastructure that makes transportation costly within countries, as well as information frictions and knowledge frictions. So Amit, you want to move on? Okay, so let me first start with kind of thinking about labor markets and human capital. So as Amit mentioned in the introduction, this is probably the area where we know most. And in particular, there's been a kind of number of compelling papers that show, you know, the substantial disruption caused by integration into global markets, particularly unilateral trade liberalizations, which there are many kind of benefits they may bring, often to consumers and to kind of firms who are able to take advantage of the increased export opportunities. But they have definitely increased import competition, and that's led to pretty substantial impacts on labor markets, particularly since we've discovered that mobility geographically is more limited than we might have expected. We've seen that both in India, in Brazil, in Mexico, even in China. And so what that means is there are these kind of local labor market effects whereby within regions that kind of have a lot of concentration in the industries which either lose out or benefit from trade, we see kind of concentrated impacts. And when we're facing more import competition, those locations have seen greater unemployment, with kind of workers also moving into the service sector, often the informal service sector. Meanwhile, where there's been export booms, we've seen kind of the opposite, as workers get pulled out of these sectors into these kind of larger manufacturing firms. And these are kind of the flip sides of the same story here. There are kind of winners and losers created, and in the areas where our kind of models predict there's losers, we found a kind of serious disruption. So that's kind of across locations where a lot of the evidence has been acquired, but also looking within locations, we've seen kind of much slower transitions than our kind of standard models, which are typically assume instantaneous transition to a kind of new equilibrium. And this means that any gains from trade might be much slower to be realized, and some of these transitions are coming from these kind of high costs of kind of moving sectors, particularly for older workers. It's not so easy to move from manufacturing to services, particularly if you already have a lot of experience, which won't necessarily translate to another industry. Then we've started to learn a little bit about labor market policies that can potentially buffer these impacts or exacerbate them. Things such as minimum wages, which may lead to much quicker transitions, but also much bigger dips upon impact as wages can't adjust, and so the unemployment margin is more prevalent. And also market power, which can potentially be increased through trade liberalization by making big firms even bigger and kind of marking down, leading to a markdown in wages, but potentially counteracted by the fact that these bigger firms tend to pay higher wages, and so more workers are able to avail themselves of those. Moving away slightly from kind of labor markets directly, but to human capital, we have reasonably robust evidence that major trade reforms affect educational choices, either because workers see higher returns to acquiring education if the opportunities that arise are high-skilled ones, or as is often the case, if the opportunities are low-skilled, kind of assembly, manufacturing, etc., then the opportunity cost of school rises and people leave school earlier. We know less about long-run implications of those choices. We've also seen substantial impacts on criminal activity associated with this labor market disruption that I mentioned above. So, here, while we have learned a lot about kind of the impacts of these trade liberalizations, there's still a lot for us to learn about optimal policy responses that will limit this disruption. I think there we're only starting to kind of scratch the surface about what type of active labor market policies should be in place in order to mitigate some of these negative impacts, in order to allow countries to take full advantage of the kind of jobs generated by trade, the sectors which kind of grow through liberalization. So that's in terms of labor markets. There's also been some work on capital markets, although much less. Capital markets are very intricately related to trade, since, simply put, cross-border trade is very costly, and it takes a long time from the point when you kind of finish producing a product or start producing a product to when you receive money from the buyer. And so what this means is that there's often substantial financial costs to exporting, either from preparing for exporting by acquiring the correct licenses or certifications, or the payment or the costs needed to go often to visit the destination country and find buyers, familiarize yourself with local requirements, maybe upgrade the quality of your products, and also the trade credit you need in order to kind of take you from the time you have to buy the inputs to the time you receive the payment, that may be months, many months apart. And so, naturally, if countries face severe, firms in those countries face severe credit constraints, that's going to limit the gains from trade. And indeed, that's what the evidence suggests. It's going to reduce export volumes as well as entry into exporting. And there's some recent work showing that there's also these kind of firm-specific elements where these credit constraints seem to particularly bind for exporters who maybe are kind of better firms who are kind of running up against these constraints, and so credit constraints are holding back these firms on the margin. Kind of another dimension people have started to think about, including Pamela, who's here today, is thinking about frictions in capital markets that prevent firms from quickly moving capital out of some industries and into other industries, as we would hope would happen in our standard models when we're changing the kind of relative prices in the country through trade liberalization. And so the fact that it's kind of hard to disinvest, it's hard to find buyers for capital that you no longer need, and hard to move capital to other sectors, is going to kind of limit the speed of those transitions and reduce those gains. So in the review, we kind of highlight a bunch of open questions in capital. And for us, kind of the really big ones are, we think trade credit's a huge deal, but also a bunch of these kind of the plumbing of international trade has been very understudied, particularly currency invoicing, whether you can invoice in your own currency. Typically not if you're a developing country. You have to kind of be, you have to invoice in US dollars or potentially euros. And that means you're facing a lot of additional risks, and we're only starting to kind of learn about what that may lead to, and also financial hedging, the availability of those services or lack of availability, and how that may make the gains from trade larger. And so these are areas where I think we need a lot more work. So turning to other market level distortions, so kind of input distortions on materials, on land, on energy. Here we know quite a lot about material input distortions. In fact, along with labor, this is probably the area that's kind of best covered. We have robust evidence now that trade liberalization allows firms to access higher quality intermediates that they can purchase from abroad, and that's going to lead to higher productivity, higher quality of output, and greater variety of domestic products, which will kind of all benefit consumers or other firms who purchase these products. We've also starting to learn using the kind of rich firm-to-firm transaction data that's starting to become available in several markets, in several countries, how input market distortions can propagate through firm-to-firm trade networks, and start to think about where these distortions might be most important, and so where policymakers might want to attempt to reduce these distortions the most. While I think materials have been covered quite well in the literature, where there's been almost no work are in kind of the two other very big input markets that we think in developing countries are kind of riddled with distortions, which are land markets and energy markets with pervasive blackouts, differential pricing across firms, etc. So there we think there's a lot more work to be done. One area that's particularly promising, which has kind of seen a shockingly little analysis in the trade literature, is special economic zones or export processing zones, which are kind of set up in part to navigate around land constraints in some countries, but also some of the labor regulations and other frictions we've talked about. Okay, so the next thing we talk about is imperfect competition and markups. This could go in a variety of places, and we've decided to place it here in the review. And there's kind of this idea floating around that developing country markets are particularly uncompetitive. Just as one example, we think antitrust enforcement is almost entirely absent. But we actually have surprisingly little evidence one way or another for whether or not these markets are more uncompetitive. here there's kind of been a recent set of papers that are starting to ask these questions, but again, our knowledge is extremely limited. Where we kind of know a little bit more is about whether trade liberalization raises or reduces markups. And obviously, kind of pro-competitive effects of trade are kind of central to a lot of kind of the literature that thinks about trade and imperfect competition. Here, the evidence is somewhat ambiguous. We have found that final goods, trade liberalization does seem to kind of reduce markups on those. But meanwhile, often trade liberalization, as we've talked about above, reduces input costs by reducing barriers to those imports. And there in India, we've seen actually markups rising in response to kind of lower import prices. And so these things could go in different directions. And, lurking in the background are these very thorny measurement issues, which I think we are still debating in the literature about how best to deal with these. And I think there's kind of scope here for a lot more evidence through detailed data collection and even randomized control trials to learn more about how markups respond to trade in various forms. One area here which the IO literature has pursued is by focusing on specific industries where you can really maybe do a good job at understanding production functions, understanding markups, and that may be a kind of fruitful direction to go, rather than try to do things in aggregate for the whole economy, which may be a heroic task. And also here we have a kind of a big question on what are the policy levers to increase competition. Again, we talk about antitrust in developing countries, in developed countries. Is that really feasible in many of the world's poorest countries? What could be done to facilitate greater competition? So I think those are all kind of key questions going forward. So kind of another friction we kind of think hard about in the review of domestic trade frictions, think about kind of the poor infrastructure in developing countries. That means there's often kind of high costs of moving goods within countries, maybe even greater than the costs of moving them across countries. And obviously this is going to distort supply chain decisions. It's going to make it hard to build domestic supply chains across regions if it's very costly to move goods between them. It's also going to alter the distribution of the gains from trade within countries. If it is extremely costly to get from the port to the interior of the country, then those people on the interior may see little benefit from kind of border policies, given that they're kind of isolated from those effects. Kind of another impact of these kind of high domestic costs is, this is going to lead to kind of isolated smaller markets. That's going to limit the scope for firms to yield economies of scale. It's also going to lead to kind of limited entry of firms. That's going to lead to less competition and kind of limited pass-through of things, external shocks such as price changes. And so kind of one way to think about this is, consumers will benefit less from kind of falls in price at the border, but also farmers will benefit less from rises in world prices, say, of coffee, given these kind of more isolated markets, there's limited pass-through, etc. Often at the other end here, we immediately think about intermediaries who often are kind of the partial beneficiaries of these kind of losses to the producers or the consumers, and they're often accruing rents. Obviously, there's some distortions as well, some losses as well. Here, there's a kind of growing but small literature trying to think about what would be the benefits of reducing intermediate or removing intermediaries or steps of intermediation. Would that potentially benefit the end consumer or producer, or perhaps not by now stopping access to certain goods or products that the intermediaries were able to provide through the economies of scale they have in trading. Similarly, fair trade certification and other such policies may provide a way to provide a kind of better deal for consumers or for farmers or workers or producers, etc. And here, again, we find mixed results. Sometimes they don't seem to do much, but in other cases, we are starting to see impacts depending on kind of the nature of those programs. And then finally, kind of the final link in the kind of supply chain is often the retailer a lot of these consumer impacts kind of go through retailers, and they're very big employers as well. And so we think this sector is very much understudied, but we do have some evidence that foreign entry kind of raises productivity and benefits kind of consumers in these sectors, and also potentially reduces markups by increasing competition. So, as with the last topic of imperfect competition more directly, there's a bunch of questions here related to, what are optimal infrastructure policies, but also what are effective policy remedies for kind of poorly functioning intermediation markets. And here, some of those solutions are a little unclear. We gave the example of, taking out links in the supply chain or in the chain of intermediation may potentially backfire. So finally, in this section, we kind of think about information frictions and knowledge frictions. These can take kind of two broad forms in the way we write them down. We can think about search and matching frictions. That may be, firms searching for the best prices on where to sell their goods, or farmers are searching for the best prices on where to sell their goods, or firms searching for which products to buy, say wholesalers or retailers, for which products to buy in foreign markets and bring back, or what quality levels of inputs to purchase, or which input provided to purchase from, or to find buyers to purchase their goods in foreign countries. And we're starting to learn that these types of search and matching frictions are incredibly important and may in fact reduce trade more than traditional trade costs, tariffs, transportation costs that we typically focus on. And so these types of frictions deserve definitely a lot more attention. Beyond search and matching frictions, there are also kind of frictions in the flows of knowledge, either across firms or between countries. And that's going to limit the adoption of kind of better technologies, better management practices. And here we think trade and FDI are important conduits for these technologies, both through processes like learning by exporting, or potentially learning by importing, or through kind of matches between kind of big foreign firms and kind of smaller developing country producers, which may allow this information to flow. So, as with many of the other topics, as a slew of open questions here, we need to do much more to think about policies that alleviate these search and matching frictions. And we have some exciting work being done on credit bureaus and commodity exchanges and quality standards, which may ameliorate these issues. And kind of the second big open question is, why are there these large kind of market failures in the knowledge market? Where are these coming from? And once we can identify those, we may start to be able to come up with policies to alleviate these market failures and allow knowledge to flow more freely between firms and across countries. Okay, so we kind of wrap up the review by thinking about firm level distortions. These kind of differ because they're going to kind of vary within a particular type of distortion, say credit distortions. Some firms will be more constrained than others, or some sectors might be more constrained than others. Here we immediately start thinking about misallocation. If firms face different distortions or different wedges, then they're going to use factors in different proportions, and there'll be a misallocation of resources across firms. Trade in principle could worsen or improve that misallocation. And this is kind of an exciting area people are starting to think about. Generally, if we think trade leads large firms to expand relative to small firms, and that would come straight out of something like a Melitz model, then we would expect this to be kind of good for efficiency, for allocative efficiency. If big firms are the most constrained, maybe they face higher taxes, or they're the most credit constrained because they are the ones who kind of demand the most credit and can't get it. Or maybe there's the biggest externalities associated with them we can think of in this framework as well. But of course, the flip side's true. If we think the small firms are the ones who really struggle to get credit, then the opposite's going to be true, and efficiency is going to fall if we're kind of reallocating factors to larger firms through trade reform. So that's kind of through kind of changing the distribution or the exposure to other types of distortions. Very directly, trade reforms may also kind of reduce a set of distortions in and of themselves, in some sense level the playing field if the initial source of those distortions was the trade policies themselves. And we think in many settings, for example, with quotas, which are allocated by governments in a kind of non-transparent manner, or by access to export licenses and such like, that may very well be the case, and there'll be more direct impacts from removing these kind of firm-specific distortions. So we think about kind of three big areas. Following on from that introduction, we think is a particularly interesting topic of whether kind of small or big firms expand more, and related to that, whether informality increases or shrinks. Informal firms we can think of as facing fewer distortions. They don't face taxation and government regulation, but at the same time, they may have less access to capital, and so be maybe more distorted in that sense. And so it's interesting to understand what happens to those sectors with trade liberalization. Here we've seen somewhat ambiguous impacts. When we've seen export booms in Vietnam, then we see kind of those booms pull workers from small and informal firms. Meanwhile, import competition has pushed workers into the informal sector in Brazil, but in South Africa and in India, it may have done the opposite. And so, I think we still have work to go on trying to kind of aggregate these variety of impacts and kind of a better sense of what's happening to the full firm size distribution. And then obviously the remaining open question here is, are small informal firms less constrained than big ones, which is obviously critical to answering the question of whether or not these changes in the firm size distribution are going to improve or worsen efficiency. Then a second area where there's a lot of interesting work is on kind of connected firms. Often these are politically connected, either because they're state-owned enterprises that are obviously directly related to the government, or because they're kind of connected to political rulers, as in, say, Suharto's regime in Indonesia. Here again, we found ambiguous impacts. Several studies find that trade reforms kind of reduce the importance of these previous connections. Maybe previously it was vital that I have these political connections in order to get access to particular inputs. That's no longer necessary. Now I can buy them from abroad, or in order to get access to kind of quota parts of the kind of quotas to export to foreign countries, and now I can export directly when there are trade reforms. But the flip side is when there are kind of negative impacts due to greater import competition, these connected firms are often protected either because of kind of cheap capital or soft budget constraints, and that kind of limits the gains from trade by preventing the kind of reallocation of resources that trade tries to bring about. So, while we know something about political connectedness, we know much less about connections to the military, which are very important in many countries. Think Egypt, think Myanmar, where many industries are tightly linked to the military, and that's an interesting area. And also business groups more generally, which are, as Amit mentioned, pervasive in developing countries, maybe to kind of navigate the kind of lack of strong capital markets or other institutional issues, and how those impact the effects of trade liberalization, etc. And then finally, the last section is one which we could write a whole review on in itself. So we only touch somewhat briefly, but thinking about externalities and spillovers. So, there's kind of two things that are going on here. One is, as I mentioned, we think trade, for example, through kind of knowledge flows that come from kind of buyers who have built up a lot of experience over time in producing certain goods, can occur through these trade relationships, but also FDI and integration into global value chains can also lead to the flow of knowledge through these relationships. The kind of other area that people are very interested in, and there's much more work to do, is is trade kind of boosting or shrinking sectors which have the largest externalities, or boosting or shrinking firms that have the largest externalities? And that would be a kind of justification for kind of trade as industrial policy. And so there's a lot more work here to know exactly which channels through which these spillovers occur. That's going to help us know how to maximize them. And also we're kind of far from having some comprehensive understanding of which sectors, which types of firms have the biggest externalities, and whether or not these things we're identifying are truly externalities in the sense that they're kind of unpriced, or potentially we're mismeasuring those. So that's kind of a very brief summary of the kind of topics we cover in the literature. We hope you have a chance to actually read the particular sections of interest to you, and you can see all the references of all the papers that we've been talking about today. But we think this is a vibrant and exciting set of areas of research. And one thing we think is particularly exciting here is just the diversity of methods and techniques that's used, everything from randomized control trials, kind of tailored surveys that are increasingly common, IO techniques, quantitative models, etc. And so we think that's going to continue to be a fruitful path to knowledge generation. But we think that there's particular scope for progress through taking greater account of sectoral and institutional details to allow better measurement often, whether that's through administrative data or tailored surveys. And we hope there'll be more work using these types of data sources, focusing on particular contexts and settings where we can better isolate mechanisms and put us on firmer ground. So that's kind of a wrap, and we'll have a bit of time for some questions and answers. But as I mentioned, stay tuned for the next update. This is a live document which will be updated regularly, and we'd love to hear any of your